So the Moondrop Quarks were a pair of budget bullet-style IEMs that came in around $13 to $15. They came out before things like the Moondrop Chew or the Soundnote Zero, and despite not being as well tuned as those would eventually be, at the time the Quarks were very popular as a decent sounding budget IEM. Being a cheap single dynamic driver, they were small and quite comfortable to wear. They had more of an overall warm sound signature with a slight boost to the upper mids. They didn't sound that clear, but at the time they were considered good enough. Fast forward a year and Moondrop announced the Quarks DSP, the same IM but with a DAC and DSP built into the USB-C connector at the end of the cable. When frequency response graphs surfaced, it really built up a lot of hype. For $15, you could have an IM that closely followed the Harman target. When they came out, people really expressed their love for them, and at that price point, you had solid tuning that rivals IMs costing quite a lot more. So that's it then. The Quarks DSP is just a really good IM for super cheap. Not much else to say, right? Well, sadly no. There was a bit more to it than that. Some people said that they heard a bit of an inconsistent sound when listening to sustained notes or tones, almost like occasionally it would change volume or pitch for a split second. As well, some were saying to look at the group delay or phase response of the Quarks DSP. Something just seemed odd about it. And while I was a bit skeptical at first, I started inquiring a bit more about these measurements on the Quarks DSP, and ended up getting a lot of help from others who are much more experienced than me in understanding these metrics. So when looking into it, some interesting things did arise. The first thing to note is that there was definitely something odd with the phase response from these measurements of the Quarks DSP, but for a more intuitive visual, we can look at group delay as just straight up phase response can be just a little bit more confusing to look at. So looking at group delay and extracting the excess group delay, we can see the excess group delay for each frequency and measured in time, in this case in milliseconds. With a normal IM, such as the original Quarks, we can see this excess group delay creates a flat line, which is consistent throughout the frequency range. But when looking at the Quarks DSP group delay, we see this sort of odd shape where it drops down and then jumps back up and then ends up having more delay as the frequencies increase. There were some guesses as to what might be causing this, one of the guesses being possibly that it would be due to using linear phase filters instead of minimum phase filters for the EQ. But when looking into this a bit more, it seems less likely that that's the case, and some of those who were looking into this weren't satisfied with that conclusion. Now, when measuring IMs, we use a sine sweep, but the amount of time that sine sweep takes to go through the frequencies can be selected. This result came when we're using the default setting for the sine sweep, but when changing it to a very fast sine sweep, you see the group delay change, so now it's just a downslope, which still isn't ideal as it's not flat, but it does show that there is something weird going on here. So then, doing the inverse of that, with the longer sine sweep, we can see that there's actually a pattern in the excess group delay, where it seems to rise and then drop, and then slope down, and then jump up again and rise and then drop, and it keeps repeating this pattern. With an even longer sine sweep, we can see that this group delay pattern keeps repeating as the IMs are playing the tones. For what's causing this, I don't really have a solid answer for that, but more likely it's probably something like a glitch or poor implementation of the DAC itself that's inside the USB-C connector of the Quarks DSP. Something else that's interesting is whenever we look at the group delay and there's a sudden change like this, when we look back at the frequency response, there's always a small peak or dip wherever that happens in the group delay. This is also apparent throughout the rest of the sine sweeps, as wherever the group delay had that change, a little peak or dip shows up in the frequency response. This might also have something to do with what people are talking about when they say that they hear the volume or pitch periodically change for a split second when listening to music or tones. But yeah, the whole cause for this issue isn't quite conclusive yet. And I also would once again like to emphasize that it was others who discovered these effects and took the time to really look into what's going on. I was just along for the ride. But overall it's quite unfortunate, as the IEM itself is tuned very well and is quite cheap, but it seems to be held back by a glitchy DAC which could affect the enjoyment for some users. If it wasn't for that, the Quarks DSP would be just a solid IEM with great tuning and something that's super easy to recommend to anyone. But it's unfortunate that's held back by this issue, and hopefully Moondrop will be able to fix it either in the future or maybe in their future products down the road.